Okay, these are the sections through the different levels of the head. Here, just for orientation, we can see that this is the anterior part, and behind we have the posterior aspect, just for purpose of orientation. So the very first section that we have, it's relatively simple. Here we can see the fat surrounding the skull. Then we have this is the bone of the skull. We can see that it consists of the external table, the diploe, and the internal table. Then we have the two cerebral hemispheres from the very superior aspect. They are composed of white matter and on the outside gray matter. These are gray matter. The two hemispheres are separated by the deep or the median longitudinal fissure, which is occupied by the fox cerebri. This is the fox. Then this is the anterior opening, and this is the posterior opening of the superior sagittal sinus. This one here, this is the central sulcus, extending onto the superior aspect of the cerebral hemispheres. Then you have the second section. Here we can basically see the same spots, but with some additions. Again, this is the bone of the skull with its staples and its diploe. This is the temporalis muscle. And it's more obvious in the other section, but of course here are some of the blood vessels and nerves that are surrounding. Inshallah, we'll talk about it in the next section. Again, we have the white matter and the gray matter of the cerebral hemispheres. We have the superior sagittal sinus and the fox separating or occupying the median longitudinal fissure between the two cerebral hemispheres. Here we can see something in addition, which is the corona radiata, the beginning of the corona radiata within the cerebral hemispheres on both sides. So if you go one section deeper, there are some relatively new features here. Again, this is the bone of the skull, the temporalis muscle, the two cerebral hemispheres separated by the fox, the superior sagittal sinus. Then, here we have the inferior sagittal sinus. This is the opening of the inferior sagittal sinus. Lying lateral to the temporalis muscle, we have the auriculotemporal nerve, the yellow one, the superficial temporal vein, and artery. Then if we go to the central aspect, here we see the body of the lateral ventricles. These are their bodies. Inshallah, later we'll see their anterior and posterior horns. So the two bodies are separated by the septum pellucidum. And within the body of the lateral ventricles, we can see the choroid plexus. So any spot within the ventricle is the choroid plexus. Then we can also see parts of the corpus callosum, which separates or connects actually the two cerebral hemispheres. We couldn't see it in the higher sections because it's located more inferiorly. This is the anterior, we said this is the anterior aspect, so this is the genu of the corpus callosum. And its fibers that diffuse or spread anteriorly are the forceps minor. Behind, we have the splenium of the corpus callosum, and it spreads posteriorly into the forceps major. Lateral to the lateral ventricle, we can see the body of the caudate nucleus. Caudate nucleus. And then we go one more section deeper. Here, there are lots of new features. Again, the bones, the bone of the skull, and yes, we also have the frontal sinuses here. This is new. Again, this is the superior sagittal sinus, both openings. These are the temporalis muscles, the same blood vessels and nerves. And again, we have the cerebral hemispheres separated by the median longitudinal fissure. Only part of it is visible now. Again, this is the fox cerebri. And this is the gray matter of the cerebral hemispheres and the white matter. Okay, just for orientation. Now we can see some new features. This is the central sulcus. The lateral sulcus. This is the lateral sulcus. Okay. This is the inferior sagittal sinus. We said this one was the superior, the two openings of it. This is the inferior sagittal sinus. Okay, not to be confused with this part. This opening is the inferior sagittal sinus. Now we have the anterior horn and the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. If you remember in the previous section, we had the body of the lateral ventricle, but now we have the anterior horn. This is the anterior horn, or the frontal horn, and this is the posterior horn. Within the posterior horn, we have the choroid plexus. And by the way, mention the site. You say the choroid plexus of the posterior horn of the lateral ventricles, not just choroid plexus. And in the previous section, you're supposed to say the choroid plexus within the body of the lateral ventricle. Here, it's the choroid plexus of the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. Yes. Again, the corpus callosum. This is the genu and the forceps minor. This is the splenium and the forceps major. Okay. Now, lateral to, and in this most central part, we have the fornix. This is, I believe, the column of the fornix. Lateral to the anterior horns of the lateral ventricles, we have the head of the caudate nucleus. This is the head of the caudate nucleus. Then, lateral to that, we have the internal capsule. This is the internal capsule. It has the anterior limb, the genu, and the posterior limb. And it's the anterior limb, or just, this is actually a section. Just the internal capsule itself separates the caudate nucleus from the lentiform nucleus. The lentiform nucleus is divided into two parts. The Globus Pallidus, which is the most medial one, and it's lighter in color. And lateral to it, we have the putamen, the darker area here. Lateral to the lentiform nucleus, we have the external capsule. It's marked by the pen here. It's not a ridge. This is the external. And lateral to that, we have the claustrum, another part of the basal ganglial system. And beyond that, we have the insula. This is the region of the insula. It's actually the gray matter located within white matter. And so the white matter, you can say, is the white matter of the insula, but mainly this is the region of the insula. And we can see that it's associated with the lateral sulcus. As for the blood vessels in the there's also the two thalami. These are the thalami. You can see that. These are the two thalami. And as we mentioned earlier, this is the septum pellucidum, separating the two lateral ventricles. Yes, thank you. This is the third ventricle. It's a slit-like cavity between the two thalami. Okay, and the blood vessels in the anterior aspect, we have the anterior cerebral artery. Branches of the anterior cerebral artery, and in the lateral aspect, in the lateral sulcus here, these are branches of the middle cerebral artery. Okay. I believe we haven't left any features. Okay. Then we have a deeper section. Again, we can see some of the same features here. This is now a wider aspect of the frontal sinus, the bone, the muscles, temporalis muscles and others. Again, we have the two thalami, but here you can say hypothalamus, or just in general say the diencephalon, because it's not just the thalamus here, it's a deeper section. Again, we have the head of the caudate nucleus. We can see that the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle is now gone. It's not visible. This is the head of the caudate. Laterally, there is the anterior limb of the internal capsule. This is the genu and the posterior limb. Then you have the globus pallidus and the putamen of the lentiform nucleus. Then there is the external capsule. And then there's the claustrum, and lateral to that we have the insula. And this is the lateral, whatever. It couldn't be the lateral sulcus. It's possible. Again, we have the same blood vessels, the branches of the anterior cerebral, branches of the middle cerebral in this region. Now, we can see this is kind of the end of the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle with the choroid plexus in it. But now we can see another structure, which is the pineal gland. This is very important. And from here on, you can call this, which was in the other sections, in the previous sections, we called it the inferior sagittal sinus. Now we can say it's the straight sinus. But this is still the superior sagittal sinus. Here we have the straight sinus. And this is also still the fornix. I believe it's the crura of the fornix. Okay. The features remaining in this section are the optic radiations from the posterior limb of the internal capsule on both sides, going to the visual cortex, and again the third ventricle between the two parts of the diencephalon. And we also forgot a feature in the previous section, which is the tail of the caudate nucleus. Okay? This is the head, and this is the tail. Then we go a section yet deeper. Now we can see the globes or the cavities of the eyeball. These are the two locations of the two eyeballs. Here, this is still the frontal sinus. And we can see some new features here. First, this is as a landmark. This is the optic chiasm. The region. This is the region of the interpeduncular fossa. So we have the two optic nerves joining at the optic chiasm, and then we have the two optic tracts. This is the anterior cerebral branch of the internal carotid artery. This is the internal carotid artery itself, and this is the middle cerebral artery. The largest terminal branch of the internal carotid. Behind the optic chiasm, we have the pituitary stalk, or the infundibulum. Behind that, we have the two mammillary bodies. I believe we can say that this is the tuber cinereum, but not necessarily, because that's its location in the hypothalamus. But anyways, these are the two mammillary bodies. Behind, we have the region of the midbrain. Okay, so we can see the two cerebral crurae, or crura, cerebral crura. Behind it, we mentioned that it's separated. The midbrain. This is the aqueduct. The midbrain, we said, is separated to an anterior and a posterior part. Anterior to the aqueduct, it is called the cerebral peduncle, which is divided by the substantia nigra. This is substantia nigra, into the cerebral crus and the tegmentum. Okay? And this is the region of the tegmentum. This is the cerebral crus. And this is the red nucleus. This is just another part of another relay station for motor fibers of control of motor movements. And behind the cerebral aqueduct, the part of the midbrain is called the tectum, composed of the four colliculi. I believe these are the superiors, the two ones. Behind that, we have the vermis, the superior aspect of the vermis of the cerebellum. Okay? And here it is still the straight sinus. Still the straight sinus. Now this, depending on the next section, we can still say this is the inferior sagittal sinus. It has not yet become the confluence. The superior sagittal sinus. We can probably from this is the next section. We can say that it's the confluence. Here is still the superior sagittal sinus. Okay. The features remaining in this section are the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. Again, I believe this is a choroid plexus. And also part of the limbic system, the hippocampus. In the region of the eyes, we have some of the muscles visible. This is the medial rectus. This is the lateral rectus. This is the superior rectus. And in case they bring their nerve supplies, the medial rectus, the oculomotor nerve, the lateral rectus, the abducens nerve, the superior rectus is the superior oblique. Okay? And I believe this is all in this area. But as for the nerves and the blood vessels of the eyes, it is not very visible in this section. So we'll go back to the section before. We can say this is the supratrochlear nerve, the first yellow structure. Then there's the supraorbital vein, supraorbital nerve, and supraorbital artery. Okay? If this is another vein, then this is the supratrochlear vein. But anyways, just generally, the trochlears are medial to the orbitals. So this is the supratrochlear nerve. And the same for the other sections. Okay, there was a technical mistake. This is the superior rectus. It's also supplied by the oculomotor nerve. Okay? All right. And finally, we have the last section for today. Here we can see, again, the medial and the lateral recti. The medial supplied by the oculomotor nerve and the lateral supplied by the abducens nerve. Again, this is the region of the eyeballs. This is the cornea. This is the lens. Okay, as we said, this is the lens of the eyes. This is the optic nerve. Okay, and in this region we can see a number. This is the nasal cavity, the two nasal cavities separated by the nasal septum. These are the ethmoidal air cells, the anterior, middle, and posterior groups, or sinuses, the same. Behind we have the sphenoid sinuses. Behind we have the sella turcica, the region of the pituitary gland. And behind it, this is the dorsum celli, another region of the bone of that area. On either side of the sella turcica is the region of the cavernous sinus. Structures passing within the sinus are the internal carotid artery, as it enters the cranial cavity, and the abducens nerve. Okay. And behind, we have the pons, another part of the brainstem. This is still the cerebral aqueduct. Anterior to the pons, there's the basilar artery and the basilar sulcus or groove. And behind the pons, of course, there's the cerebellum, which is surrounded by the tentorium cerebelli. Behind that, now we can, this is still the straight sinus. But we can call this the confluence of the sinuses, because in the next section, it's very visible. These are the two transverse sinuses. And so we can say this is the confluence. Okay? And I believe those are all the features. And finally, we have two visible muscles. This is, again, part of the temporalis. And behind we have the occipital belly of the occipitofrontalis muscle.